right. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar about the development of the state budget. We at VACo spend a lot of time analyzing what's in the state budget and reporting on that as it's proposed and then as it's finalized. But we thought it might also be helpful for this presentation to talk about how the budget is developed, proposed, considered, and finalized, as well as the opportunities to advocate for local priorities along the way. Joining me today is Jim Regimbal, who has more than 40 years of experience in state and local budget and tax policy analysis. For 12 years, he was part of budget development as a former staff member to the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, or the Senate Finance Committee as it was known back then. In 1999, he co-founded Fiscal Analytics Limited, where his expertise in state and local budget and tax policy issues has been provided to local governments, business groups, trade associations, and nonprofit organizations. He's certainly no stranger to VACo. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of the Pacific and an MBA from Virginia Commonwealth University. So Jim, welcome. Thanks for being with us today. Jim's been part of budget negotiations at the state level for a long time, so we really appreciate you sharing a window into this process.
Thanks, Katie, and good morning.
Good morning. So let's jump right into it here. We wanted to provide a little bit of the framework within the Constitution of Virginia within which the budget is developed. So as you can see here, this is drawn from Article 10, Section 7 of the Virginia Constitution. And you can see in that bolded language that there's very definitive language in the Constitution requiring an appropriation in order to spend money from the state budget. So no money can be paid out of the state treasury except in pursuance of appropriations made by law. This part of the budget also speaks to the duration of the budget. That's where we get our biennium budget process. And also in that last paragraph there, it also outlines the governor's responsibility to execute a balanced budget. So of course, unlike at the federal level, we cannot print money or borrow to balance the budget. It has to be balanced. And this slide gives you a bit of a sense of scale of the budget. In fiscal 25, Virginia's operating budget was $92.8 billion, and that's exclusive of $3.4 billion in capital costs. So this total, we wanted to kind of break it down. This breaks down to $34.8 billion in general fund spending and $58 billion in non-general fund spending. So we wanted to kind of draw a distinction here between the general fund and the non-general fund, because many times discussion of the state budget will feature a top line number that lumps these two categories together, but they actually come from different sources and they're used for different purposes. So as a bit of an illustration here, the general funds are intended for general government purposes, and they're not necessarily dedicated or restricted. So there's some discretion at the legislature and the administration's ability to use these funds. Non-general funds, by contrast, have a specific purpose. So even though they're appropriated in the state budget for the purposes that they're intended for, they have a specific purpose. So there's federal funds that flow through the budget here, the funds that are generated by higher education operating costs, so tuition and fees or parking revenues, things of that nature, hospital revenues, dedicated funds for transportation, and then also dedicated special revenues like funds that are supported by fees. And so most of the time, what we're advocating for at VACo is funding from that general fund pot of money. That's the portion over which the General Assembly and the governor have more discretion. But as you can see, it is a smaller pot. And as we'll discuss later, there's certainly pressures on that pot of funds as well. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of context in terms of advocacy. And so Jim is going to speak about sort of how that general fund pot of money is raised and where it goes. So Jim, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, Katie. So what we have here is we have a list of all the general fund revenue sources, and the largest source, over almost $22 billion in the last fiscal year 25, was net individual income taxes, made up of withholding, the largest component, and then estimated pay, we call it non-withholding as well, $7.5 billion, which consists of capital gains, businesses having to pay on a quarterly basis, and stock market returns, things like that. Then of course you see the negative, which would be refunds that are paid out when people file their taxes. The next largest source is sales taxes, the general fund portion. There's actually two parts. Which is directly general, and then transferred in, which is really an artifact, or really just general funds at the bottom of the $588 million in 25. There's also a portion of sales taxes that are non-general fund that go to transportation, and also local government gets its share. Those are not general funds, though. The 1% local share, for example, is not a general fund, obviously. And then there's a smattering of other corporate income taxes make up a relatively large share. I do show lottery at the bottom. That's not general fund. That's non-general fund, but it's almost like I call it like a duck. It almost is used as general fund for education, but it is still a non-general fund. So that's where the money is generated for general funds, and its last current fiscal year was almost $33 billion in taxes, largest share being net individual income taxes. So move on to the next slide, and we find a pie chart showing in general terms where those general funds are spent, and really the largest shares are in K-12, public education, higher education together make up about 40% of that total general fund spending, with health and human services make up nearly 30%. And then finally, the next largest is public safety at a much smaller 8%. So in total, that they might make up the bulk of spending. You've got other expenditure items, that cross the legislative, executive, the judicial, shared natural resources, commerce and trade, and even transportation does get some general funds periodically, but that's mostly non-general funds. Transportation, we'll go into more in a second. You also have the car tax subsidy of $950 million going back to help offset car taxes at the local level, and you have interest payments. Now, that's not to make up; those interest payments aren't to make up for an unbalanced budget. As Katie said, we have to balance our budget. That is when we float debt for, let's say, capital projects, for higher ed capital projects or transportation or state buildings. That's about the $1 billion that every year we have to pay in interest payments now to support those bonds, but that's part of the balanced budget. So on the next slide, we're going to take a little closer look at non-general funds. And this also shows you the growth in non-general funds, which has been at the very bottom. You can see has been almost twice the rate of growth in general funds since 2007. And the largest single area and also the fastest growing area of non-general has been federal funds. And one way to perceive that is Medicaid. Medicaid's been growing very rapidly, and that's a shared expense with the federal government. That's the largest component of federal trust monies. But federal trust also goes to higher education in a separate category, and also transportation gets a large chunk of federal dollars as well. So in general, I would say that federal monies have been growing the fastest. You can see 343% over that time period, but also growth in tuition and fees, and all other fees have also grown rapidly. And so to make up that growth rate, that's been twice the amount of general funds. So we do rely on federal funding, and that's where some of the angst has been occurring lately with reductions in possible reductions in federal funding. We've been growing rapidly in the use of federal funds. Also, I should say one other thing. Transportation is a particular area of interest in VACo, because even though it is the transportation dollars, for example, the state transportation dollars, there's three large components of that. That's that portion of sales tax, that 0.9% I mentioned of the total sales tax charge. Also motor vehicle sales and use when you buy a car. And lastly, your gas taxes. VACo, of course, has a keen interest in how those monies are distributed. And so they're often trying to advocate and play a role in how transportation dollars are spent as well, even though it's a non-general fund.
Great point, Jim. Thanks.
So we can move to the next slide.
Yes, and that's a great point that you made about kind of the local government connection and interest in the state budget here, because this slide, it takes a second to look at the state budget through the lens of local governments and why this process is so important to us. Many of the services, as you know, provided in the Commonwealth are structured as a state supervised but locally administered system where the state and the local governments are working as funding partners. So the services are being provided locally, but there's a state administrative structure that distributes funding, sets regulations, provides guidance, et cetera. And so there's several examples that are provided here. K-12, of course, as we saw, a very large component of the state budget, also a very significant portion of local budgets as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. Social services, there's a state local funding partnership here for the administration of those programs at your local Department of Social Services. And so these would be the public benefit programs, determination of Medicaid eligibility, child welfare, foster care. So these programs generally have a split of 84.5% state contribution and a 15.5% local share there. The Children's Services Act, another pretty significant budget pressure on many local governments, but there's a state and local funding partnership there. This is complex because the match rate differs by the services provided and by locality, but there's generally this 65% state, 35% local cost sharing arrangement there. Community services boards, a lot of interest recently in terms of the state's behavioral health system. Funding here is often on a contract basis, essentially. There's a performance contract that sets out what responsibilities are going to be provided by each individual community services board, but there is an expectation, actually a statutory requirement, that localities provide at least 10% of the combined state and local pool for your community services board. Elections has been largely a local funding responsibility, although there is a state contribution there in terms of partial reimbursement for salaries of general registrars and compensation for electoral board members. And that's fallen from full reimbursement of the salaries that are set out in the Appropriation Act in recent years. And we've been trying to get that back up to 100%. And constitutional offices, a complicated arrangement here, but there is a state local funding share here where the state is providing salaries and some operating expenses for these constitutional offices, circuit court clerks, Commonwealth attorneys, and sheriffs. It's supposed to be 100% of their salaries, although that tends not to always be the case in terms of what salaries are actually being provided. And then a 50-50 cost share with commissioners and treasurers. Of course, that state contribution is for the positions that the state recognizes, which has been another area of conversation over the last few years. And then jails, in addition to the staffing that the state provides through the compensation board, the state also provides some per diem payments that assist with the care of individuals who are incarcerated in local and regional jails. So these are some examples of areas where we've engaged in advocacy at VACo with our members as we kind of try to strengthen that partnership. As noted at the top there, counties are limited in their ability to raise revenues locally and to generate their own revenue to provide these services. So the state contributions are truly vital in terms of being able to provide these services to residents in Virginia. And so, Jim, I'm going to turn it to you for kind of an overview of how the budget process works.
So Virginia uses a biennial budget process, in other words, a 2-year budget. With line item appropriations and an appropriation act that's over an inch thick. And in every even numbered year, which is what's coming up, a new budget is adopted with really 3 bites at the apple, and I'll explain that in a second. So this coming session, starting in January, we're going to be looking at the 26-28 budget, in other words, fiscal 27 and fiscal year 2028. Each year, revisions are made to this biennial budget, and so you really get 3 bites at the apple. So we'll have our first bite will be this year at the new biennium coming up fiscal 27, July 1st of next in 2026. But each year we can revise that budget. So, for example, we also are going to have a caboose bill this year, which is going to be revising fiscal 26, and there's only going to be less than half a year left when that's finally adopted. So there's usually only very minor changes to that, but there could be changes. So 3 bites of the apple to each biennium. In reality, therefore, you have a new budget adopted each year, and each you have you get changes each year to the budget, and so the final year, as I said, for the existing budget is going to happen this year in what's they call the caboose bill. The governor does get first bite of the apple. He presents his budget proposal to the legislature in mid-December of each year, and he has his departments help develop that budget. His secretariats, they're developing that budget, and it comes out, it's proposed to the General Assembly in mid-December. The budget process, and we're going to get more into this in subsequent slides, but it starts with a very important element, which is the revenue forecasting. You have to know how much money you have to spend, in other words, to develop a budget, and there's a process to that revenue forecasting. And then developing, you have to help agencies help you develop their spending proposals, and they try to use at least a strategic planning approach in the executive branch. In other words, not just looking at the existing year, but looking out over more like a six-year period to see where things are going and where they should go. Of course, the executive branch takes a good look at what the spending proposals are, and then the legislative branch gets its crack at the apple and actually is quite powerful. They have the money committee staffs, they have the money committees. They do a good look at what's been proposed to them by the governor. They adopt any amendments that they agree on, and then finally the governor has to execute that budget. He has to agree. He gets a chance to make amendments and offer vetoes as well, but he also has to execute that budget and make sure that we don't spend more than what has been appropriated. Of course, the governor, as I said, gets that first bite, and he also has a lot of power over projecting revenues because it's really an executive branch process that does most of the revenue forecasting. So we can go to the next slide.
There we go. Great. Thanks, Jim. I think that was a great overview that this is really a continual process. I mean, it's really a year-round effort. So I wanted to just provide a little bit more of an overview of some of the things that are in the budget, kind of broad brush. So the General Assembly will vote on thousands of pieces of legislation during the session. I mean, truly thousands, but the budget is one of the most important bills that they will consider, because in addition to appropriating the state resources, which we've discussed, there is a lot of policy in the budget too. So really a lot of language, not strictly dollars and cents. So there's some language items that'll be short term. For example, that bullet on here about the work group to look at the water quality improvement fund, that has an end date. It's a 2-year study, but it has an end date. So there will often be sort of short term direction to agencies to do a certain thing by a certain time and report back by a certain date, et cetera. But sometimes there's language in the budget that is carried over from budget to budget and sort of remains for years. So many of the provisions of the state Medicaid program are like that. They're sort of detailed in the budget and they just kind of live in the budget. And very importantly, the Appropriation Act's provisions supersede the state code during the period that the budget is in effect. So for example, there are areas in the code where the budget has overridden those code provisions, and sometimes for years. So the Virginia code requires funding of sheriff's deputies at a certain ratio for sheriff's offices that have primary law enforcement responsibility, but funding hasn't been provided at that ratio for many years. So advocacy-wise, it's important to remember that the code changes are important, and you want to get the code to say what you want it to say, but the budget has to be aligned with the code requirement if there's funding involved. So we'll move on a little bit to talk a little bit more about process here. Wanted to give sort of a graphical representation of the budget calendar in terms of the summer and fall process. So where we are as we're taping this webinar in late October, we're sort of between the 4th and 5th box on this chart. But to kind of wind the clock back a little bit to late summer, this is when agencies get their guidance on what they're supposed to be including in their budget submissions in the summer. And so those submissions are typically due in September, sort of late September. In August, there is a presentation by the governor to the money committees, and the governor traditionally reports on how the previous fiscal year wrapped up and provides a preview of the governor's priorities for the budget that will be proposed later in the year. So it's a little bit of a sneak preview. Gives you kind of a sense of major priorities, how things are going, what you might expect later in the year. So that's an important milestone in the process. Then the agency decision packages are completed. And these are proposals. It's important to remember, I think Jim mentioned a couple slides ago that these go through an executive branch review to determine whether to include this in the governor's budget or not. But it is helpful to review them because they provide a sense of sort of key budget pressures and administration priorities. So for example, we've seen in the package of amendments this year, a proposal to fund growth in the CSA program, which is really not optional, but it gives you sort of a sense of projected growth in the program. We've also seen a series of proposed investments in improving the administration of the SNAP program, because that's an administration priority based on some action at the federal level. So as I said, these are proposals. They're not necessarily going to be included in the governor's budget, but it is sort of an important indicator of priorities in the administration. So then in the late fall, we start the revenue forecasting process sort of in earnest here, and Jim's going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, but there is sort of several important meetings that happen in the fall to advise the governor on putting the revenue forecast together. And then in mid-November, the legislature, the money committees will meet, and they have several days usually for each committee where they carve out some time to do a deep dive on and have presentations from their staff and from outside experts on big picture issues and major items of interest for the upcoming session. And so this is helpful in that it signals the priorities of the important legislative committees that are going to be reviewing the budget. So in terms of the summer and fall opportunities to advocate, to just talk for a minute about how you can kind of connect with the process at this point in the calendar. This is a great time to go out and meet with people. It's incredibly hard to do this during the session because you will be lucky to get 10 minutes with legislators during the session. But in the summer and fall, there's usually more time to go out and visit and sort of make your case. And so it's important to start laying that groundwork early. Getting information in the right hands is important. Meeting with your state agencies, your legislators, your administration, governor's staff, and also money committee staff, so that they will understand what you're proposing when it comes across their desk during the session. Piece of advice that, remember, it may take some time for something to be funded, and you may want to kind of consider alternative approaches, maybe looking at non-general fund funding sources, so that you're not necessarily trying to compete against all the other general fund needs for that smaller pot of money. Maybe looking at pilot programs, and just remember that you're competing against all these other general fund needs, and so you'll really have to make your case against all the other competing needs out there. And so Jim, I'm going to hand it back to you to talk about revenue forecasting.
So one reason revenue forecasting is so important is because the Appropriation Act is really based on the revenue forecast. It's not based on actual revenues directly. For example, they're going to be developing the next biennium budget based on a forecast developed mostly in the fall of this year, and the appropriations for the next biennium don't start until July 1st, 2026. Now, yes, actual revenues are important to the sense that if you get more revenues or less revenues, that gets factored into your next bite at the apple of that Appropriation Act. But as an example, for the last 5 years, we've had revenue surpluses, and so our Appropriation Act has sort of under forecasted the amount of money available, but we've had large balances for the next bite at the apple available to spend. And so that's why if I showed you that slide in the beginning of general fund revenues of a little under 33 billion, but we were spending almost 35 billion that year is because we had balances available from previous years that had, as a result of actual revenues coming in that hadn't been forecasted. So the revenue part is important because that's what's going to limit the ability to develop this budget coming up. And so how it works is it's really a three-step process. There's an econometric model developed by the Department of Taxation that tries to use really data points, previous historical data points that will forecast the economic variables such as employment, such as inflation, you know, the state's gross state product, how fast it will grow, and you got a model that tries to forecast that. That's a tough thing to do because nobody really knows the future, even based on prior history. It doesn't always tell you what the future is. But that model is then reviewed by a board of economists, by experts that put their 2 cents into whether they believe that model is going to be as close to right as possible, and they may make some tweaks to it, and then the estimates by this board of economists are reviewed by a business group called the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates, and that's a board that consists of business leaders that have their finger on the pulse of Virginia's economy, different businesses that are really are important to Virginia, and also has legislators, money committee legislators, and some governor's people on it. So they can make the final call on what the revenue forecast should be. And finally, any tax policy changes that might be introduced by the governor will be included in the revenue forecast. But of course, it's important whether or not those tax policy changes are adopted by the General Assembly. So ultimately, the revenue forecast will take account of whether tax policy changes have been adopted. And so that's the process of how revenues are forecast. And as I said in the beginning, they've tended to be conservative because there's always risks on the horizon. So forecasts are usually on the conservative side because the state, rightly so, would rather under forecast revenues than over forecast, because the over forecast, then you've got to either use our rainy day fund or you have to cut spending. And the reality of us having under forecast our revenues for the last 5 years, and generally under forecasting, is we now have a relatively large, we do have a large rainy day fund, both a constitutionally mandated rainy day and a voluntary one that was set up, and it's over $4.5 billion, which is about 15% of the general fund we now have in reserves, and that's largely a result of mandated deposits because we've had revenue surpluses. So the Constitution actually tells us that the revenue forecast binds the Appropriation Act to that forecast. And in July of in 2003, a provision was added that if the forecast falls more than 1% or more, then we can do a reforecast in July. We don't have to wait until later in the fall. But also, it allows you to dip into the constitutionally mandated rainy day fund. So any shortfall of 1% or more, you can use half of the amount of that shortfall and make up for it with your rainy day fund. And so that's the way you can get into that buildup of revenue reserves. We also have a voluntary reserve that can be used at any time the General Assembly wants, but about half of that 4.5 billion, a little more than half, is now in the constitutional rainy day fund, which can be used only if you have a bad revenue forecast. In other words, you have a shortfall of more than 1%. Non-general funds are also forecasted every year. It's not as important there in the sense that it just gives people an idea of how much money is going to be available for the various non-general fund sources. but they're actually constrained as already by the amount that comes in. So even though they do a forecast, they're still constrained by how much money you get for, let's say, federal transportation dollars. You can't spend any more than you have. So they're just there to give people mostly an idea of what's going to be available for non-general funds. So now let's talk about the spending items in the governor's budget. Uh, the budget process begins with a base budget. In other words, what has been spent in the previous year, but you remove the one-time spending items. And then often, for example, salary increases, which are not one-time, often begin in the middle of a fiscal year. So you have to annualize any part year funding to determine your current service costs. So that's sort of the start of your budget process. Start with what you did in the past, remove one-time spending, and annualize part year funding. Then agencies are offered the opportunity to request increased appropriations. And it makes sense because there's inflation in general terms. And so if there's increased rents, for example, the agency will ask for an increased appropriation for things, but they also are going to ask for items they believe are important. And so if they have a new program or they need to increase spending beyond inflation, they will request that spending through the executive branch process of going through the secretariats and the governor. And then if they do get the executive branch believes that these are necessary items to spend new money on, that will be included in the governor's introduced budget. The Department of Planning budget is there to coordinate all of that, and they coordinate the governor's spending plan. They also, are important in putting all this together. And so, state agencies and any state institutions, they have to submit these spending proposals to DPB with their rationale in the summer. So that's already occurred, and there's already decisions made being based on the strategic planning process I described of whether they believe this is going to be important, these spending items for the long term. And DPB will help coordinate with the Secretary of Finance, Governor, and the other secretariats whether or not they can include any new items into that introduced budget. Of course, that is limited. They have to make decisions based on the revenues available. So that's, again, why revenues are important. So this is a prioritization process for any new spending. They also, DPB, planning and budget, in every even numbered year, they're going to put out a 6-year financial spending plan to give people an idea of what current spending, what will happen over the longer term if you adopt spending items, and whether we can afford that, and try to do a 6-year forecast of revenues as well to determine whether the spending that we're doing now can continue into the future. Capital is a separate item, and it's coordinated and vetted by a advisory committee, a 6-year capital outlay plan advisory committee, which includes both executive and executive branch members. And one of the things that happens in capital is generally you will have to get approved for planning money through this advisory committee first before you actually get the money to build a project. So the first thing they'll do is, yes, they'll agree that a capital item, for example, a building at a college campus is necessary. And the first thing that happens is they'll get planning money for that included in their plan before the full amount is included in the governor's budget or adopted by the General Assembly. But of course, as I said, there's legislative members on this advisory committee as well. And so the General Assembly has a big say in whether capital items are adopted and put into the plan. I'll turn it back to you, I believe.
Yes. Yes. So you have outlined that there's been months and months of planning and preparation. And now we've gotten to the point in the calendar where the governor is releasing the introduced budget. So this is the date that's been circled in red on everyone's calendar. And here we are. So by statute, this has to be done by December 20th. And this is, of course, a major milestone in the process of budget development. So the governor will make a presentation to the Money Committee. So this is House Finance, House Appropriations, and Senate Finance and Appropriations. And this will be typically kind of a high-level briefing about kind of major items that are included in the budget, and then followed by the Secretary of Finance, who typically talks about economic conditions and digs a little more deeply into the revenue forecast. And then the Department of Planning and Budget Director will typically follow and talk about some of the major spending items. So the revenue forecast that was developed that Jim just talked about is included. There's also regular updates to the mandated and ongoing programs. So some of the forecasted growth in programs like CSA or Medicaid. Medicaid can be a very significant element of the governor's budget. And the standards of quality rebenchmarking, which is done for a new biennium. So we're going to pause for a couple minutes here to talk about SOQ rebenchmarking, since K-12 spending is such a large component of state and local budgets. And Jim, I'm going to hand that over to you.
So as Katie said, the K-12 standards of quality and K-12 spending in general makes up the largest share of the state general fund, about 30%. And also of note, it's about 3/4 of the state funding that goes back to localities. So it's a huge component of what localities are concerned about is K-12 funding. And so I want to spend a little bit of time discussing that. The standards of quality is really the minimum amount of money that has to be spent for public education in Virginia that's designated by the General Assembly. The reality is a much larger amount is spent than what that minimum standard of quality is. Every locality spends more than what is required by law. And first, the standards of quality is talked about in the state constitution, but the actual elements of the standards of quality are in the State Appropriation Act and in the Code of Virginia. So as I said, it's the minimum amount, and the state provides when they and I'll show you a slide in a second, but the state determines what goes into that SOQ formula. Think of the number of teachers, teachers' salaries, other employees that are in the school divisions that they determine are necessary, equipment funding. That's part of the standards of quality, and the state will provide 55% of what they determine is that standard, 45% on average by localities. Of course, that's just on average. Localities actually provide, and the state provides to the school divisions, depends on what the local composite index is. Every locality has a different composite index, which actually determines that school division's share or that locality's share of what they must provide for the SOQ and for some of the other funding items, which include lottery funding, which is really outside of the SOQ. So that $1 billion in lottery funding provided is not in the standards of quality, but every locality takes advantage of it and does receive lottery funding. There's incentive funding as well that, for example, at-risk funding, at-risk education, some of the other funding are called incentive funds, but every locality is going to take advantage of that as well. So they're going to utilize that incentive funding, and they're often going to have to match it with their share of the composite index as well. And then there's an item called categorical funding, which is very particular items spread out through the K-12 funding appropriation. A special school here might get some funding, special types of teaching programs that's called categorical funding. Mostly those are not don't require a composite index because it's just grants essentially for various smaller programs. But so there are really 4 types of funding that goes to K-12. The largest, about 80%, being the standards of quality. In total, state K-12 funding was $10.7 billion in fiscal 25 out of the roughly $33 billion in total general funds. In 2023, The Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee, which is JLARC, commonly known as, concluded that the SOQ, as designated by the General Assembly and Governor, was shortchanging school divisions by 3.5 billion a year, with the largest amount of that, 1.8 billion, being really not recognizing all the teachers and other positions that are actually being employed by local school divisions that should be covered by the SOQ. And the General Assembly has been considering that, trying to, they have provided some funding, particularly at-risk students. Some of the recommendations by JLARC for at-risk students and ESL students, English second language students, but most of that has not been adopted, primarily due to the fact that there hasn't been enough revenue to cover that 3.5 billion. But VACo is, as an example, has been very involved in trying to convince the General Assembly and Governor to fund that, because it's such an important item to localities that they get adequate K-12 funding. And then let's talk just a little bit about rebenchmarking. Rebenchmarking occurs every 2 years at the beginning of the biennium. So this will be the first cut at the apple for the 26-28 budget. Therefore, rebenchmarking will occur for that biennium in the fall. It normally had occurred by this time, at least the first cut at it, but we haven't seen that yet. You can expect somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion rebenchmarking every 2 years. Think of inflation. Think of having to include salary increases that have occurred in the current biennium that they're going to have to then fund in the next biennium. Think of updating student counts, changes in the number of students, because the SOQ and most of the funding in education are paid on a per pupil basis. So when the numbers of pupils change, you have to add or decrease the amount of funding, and that includes gifted, that includes at-risk students, that includes just your general student. Then there's also the retirement system changes, and the proposal for this next biennium is actually that the contribution rate go down. And so you may see a reduction in funding required for retirement if it's adopted by the General Assembly. It wasn't last time. So because the VRS proposes a change doesn't mean the General Assembly adopted. The General Assembly could decide that they want to continue to bolster the retirement system and get rid of all of the unfunded liabilities, although we're getting pretty close to full funding. So maybe they will adopt the proposal to reduce retirement. That will help localities as well, because they have to provide their share of that retirement contribution. But there's other fringe benefit changes as well that are included in the rebenchmarking. But think of inflation and salaries and student counts as the main elements of what rebenchmarking constitutes. So this will give you a little slide of what is in the SOQ funding process. You can see that at the top, the major elements that go into the standards of quality are what are the teacher staffing ratios for kindergarten. It's 1 teacher for every 25 students, for example, and so on and so forth through the different classes. The numbers of students go into there. What are the salaries? And they call it prevailing salaries. The prevailing salaries are developed currently with a complicated methodology that's not exactly a weighted average, because it lofts off the very highest and the very lowest, and then it counts every school division the same in terms of no matter what its size is on its average salary. And so prevailing salaries, because there's mostly large school divisions dominate, but they're not considered any differently than the smaller ones. Usually prevailing salaries undercount the amount of salary that you actually pay across the Commonwealth. So that's another area that JLARC said should be fixed, that really don't use that methodology, use a more weighted average methodology. You can see fringe benefits go into the standards of quality, support costs, think of bus drivers, maintenance people, there's others, the administrative folks that are all in those support costs. They also have prevailing costs calculated for that, and then inflation, as we discussed. And then it boils down to how you divide all those things in the SOQ middle down to the actual school divisions by their actual student counts and by the type of account that we're talking about, because there's about 9 or 10 different SOQ accounts. Finally, you get a share of the sales tax that goes to school divisions based on school age population, which is another complicating factor. It includes all the kids that are eligible to go to public education, but might be going to private schools, might be homeschooled. They're still counted. The localities get a share of the 1/8 cents of the sales tax that goes to a distribution on school age population, and that goes into the basic aid calculation before the composite index is applied. So that's the only element where you don't have the major element, because that's over $1 billion a year that goes into the SOQ without the composite index applied. So that's important to note that that's something that you don't have to match directly, at least. And then, of course, this graph shows you do have most elements of the SOQ have the composite index, and you're in your locality, which, by the way, every 2 years is recalculated. And I'm going to talk about that in a second more, but that's being recalculated and going to be presented to all the school divisions this fall, as well as the rebenchmarking, and it'll be included in the governor's introduced budget. So that's the SOQ funding process. It is complicated. That's a very cursory explanation of it, but it gets complicated. So now let's talk briefly about the local composite. It's been a source of angst and concern since I've been around. It was developed in the 1970s. It's a very crude way of trying to measure a locality's ability to pay for their share of this standards of quality and the other K-12 funding programs that have that applied. It does not measure actual level of revenue generated by locality. What it does is it uses three what we call revenue capacity indicators that were, at the time, they tried to mimic where a locality had the ability to raise revenue. So 50% of the capacity indicators, 50% is true market value of real estate, and that's supposed to reflect your ability to raise revenue through real estate tax. 10% is taxable sales. That's that money that goes back to you for school age, based on school age population. 10% of the time is roughly the share of your local budget you got in taxable sales, and the rest, 40%, is Virginia adjusted gross income. That's your resident. That's each locality's residents. Virginia adjusted gross income that goes into the calculation of your income taxes, and it's who lives in your locality and basically how much money they make. That 40% is supposed to represent all your other tax sources, your meals taxes, transient occupancy, any other way that you raise revenue in a locality. That 40% was supposed to represent that. Now, JLARC, in their that 2023 study, wanted to do a couple tweaks to this, wanted to actually do a much more disaggregated look at a locality's ability to raise revenue by their taxes. And it also, you wanted to use a 3-year average to help smooth any large changes that might occur. For example, if a large gas plant, a natural gas plant went into Greensville County, that would increase their true market value of real estate greatly and change in 1 year, it did change their local composite index. It went up a lot. So it would try to smooth that out over a 3-year period. Then I talk about how the denominator is a part of the local composite index, and that's just as important, if not more important. The denominator are two indicators. So that the numerator is the revenue capacity, and then it's divided by 2/3 of your public school population, your ADM, and then 1/3 population. And so that is supposed to be an indication of where you have to spend your money in your locality. So JLARC also recommended this change as well, because the reality is that localities spend about half their money on public education and about half on everything else, health and human services, community development, public safety, etc. And so they proposed that the denominator of the comp be changed to 50-50 from 2/3, 1/3. And that would have big changes on localities' composite indexes, as well, because some localities certainly spend more or some less on those, and some, for example, localities such as Richmond that has a relatively small share of their population that actually uses public education schools, they would be helped by going to half and half, because by having a small population of students, it makes your composite index go up. That's why it's so important, that denominator, because some localities have large shares of their population going to public schools. Some have much smaller. So changing that would have an impact as well. So finally, the composite index, that is your state share of those 5 items, gets multiplied by 0.45 to get the local share on average, and then 55% state on average. And so finally, everyone's composite index will range from about 0.18, which is the lowest, and some Western Virginia localities have, and some central cities, poor central cities, have closer to 0.18, but that can go as low as possible. And the maximum of 0.8, which would be the locality would have to pay 80% of the standards of quality and other funding items, and the state would only pay 20%. There are about 10 localities that have that, some in Northern Virginia, some that have large nuclear power plants in them have 0.8. So it's capped at that, though. So even though the calculation might go above 0.8, the state does cap it, and it will always provide 20% of the locality's SOQ amounts. And as I said, the only large amount of state K-12 aid that isn't influenced by the LCI is the sales tax distribution based on school age population. So that's the composite index. There's been a lot of proposals over the years and ideas by General Assembly to change that, because not everyone is happy with what the local composite index is. The problem with changing it is it's a zero-sum game. If one locality goes up, another goes down, and vice versa. So it becomes a real political nightmare to try to change this calculation.
Jim, thanks. You distilled a lot of information in a couple slides there, because we get a lot of questions about SOQs and the local composite index. So thanks for including that. We thought it'd be helpful to pause for a little bit and spend a little bit of time there, because it is such an important element of budget development for everyone. So to kind of pick back up on things that are in the governor's introduced budget, Jim touched on the VRS rates. That's a biennium process of developing the new rates, which, as Jim mentioned, are adopted by the VRS board, but then considered by the General Assembly. Any required deposits, the Revenue Stabilization Fund, water quality, technical updates that have to be made, such as sales tax, the K-12 enrollment. And then the last 2 are sort of more discretionary, recommendations from studies and commissions that the governor chooses to include, and then administration initiatives. So in recent years, and I think Jim touched on this, we've seen some pretty major tax policy proposals included in the governor's budget, as well as, of course, every governor will put forward the initiatives that he or she would want to put forward for consideration by the General Assembly. So, for example, certain behavioral health investments that have been a priority of this current administration. So we at VACo will review the governor's budget. We put an analysis together that goes out in our newsletter, so you'll want to be watching for that in December to kind of see sort of what made it in. So what happens next? Now what? So the governor's budget will be introduced as both House and Senate bills, and traditionally the money committee chairs are the patrons of those bills. So it is introduced as a bill, although it's not treated like any other bill. There's special rules that govern the timing and the process of how the budget is considered. However, it is subject to amendment. And so that's where we see an example of the proverb that often gets quoted around Richmond, that the governor proposes and the General Assembly disposes. So there's an opportunity for General Assembly members to submit proposed amendments, and typically those amendments are due early in the session, usually by that first Friday of the session. So we typically at VACo will work with legislators to submit a package of amendments. that'll address county needs that may not have been necessarily addressed in the governor's budget. We will often be asking our members to help advocate for those amendments. Folks who have been to County Government Day have often been part of that. There are huge numbers of budget amendments that get requested by members, and the aggregate dollar amount of what is requested is very large. So the money committees will be working through this large number of budget requests, typically using their subcommittee structure to kind of sift through. And then, of course, they're developing their own proposals. And so those committee budgets will come out on what we affectionately call Budget Sunday, which is usually sort of early to mid-February, depending on whether you're in a long or a short session. And so these proposals, it's important to remember, are a package of amendments that are drawn to the introduced budget. And so this sometimes can be a total rewrite of the governor's budget, but it'll reflect each chamber's priorities, and it includes bills that each chamber passes that requires money to implement, because traditionally they feel that they need to fund what they move forward in terms of legislative initiatives. And so because this is a package of amendments that are drawn to the introduced budget, if you don't see amendments that take things out of the governor's budget, then those things just remain in. So sometimes strategically, it's helpful to have something in the governor's budget and just try to work to keep it in there, as opposed to trying to put something in the budget that wasn't included to begin with. So after Budget Sunday, each chamber gets an opportunity to vote. The full chamber, House and Senate, will vote on the budget that came out of the Money Committee proposal. And so there's a floor debate. Money Committee members will speak to individual items that may have questions or objections raised to them. Members have the opportunity to offer floor amendments. I mean, typically those amendments don't usually succeed, but there is an opportunity to offer them and discuss them. Typically the budget passes by pretty wide margins in each chamber. Then after it passes, the budgets cross over to the other chamber and get voted down, just procedurally as the road to putting a bill into conference. And so they kind of reject each other's budgets, place the bill into conference. There's a committee of budget conferees that it's appointed. In the past, this has been 12 members drawn from the money committees on each chamber. So a very small and powerful group of people. Those negotiations that the conference committee conducts are held in private. So budget conferees are kind of scarce and hard to find when they're negotiating. So you kind of have to make your wishes known before that budget gets placed in a conference. I would say the budget conference is a pretty opaque process if you're not in the room where it happens, so to speak. But then there is a compromise struck sometimes in the middle of the night, and a conference report is produced. And so again, this is a package of amendments that are still drawn to the introduced budget, and this will reflect sort of a compromise between the two chambers' positions. So typically what you see coming out of conference, there's some items from each budget proposal, although sometimes there are some novel items that come out of conference that were not included in either budget, and usually there's a requirement to provide a list of those so folks know when they're voting on them that these were some items that weren't considered along the way. There has been a rule in recent years that the conference report has to be made available 48 hours before it's voted on, so that members have an opportunity to review it and ask questions. But then when it comes time to vote, it's an up or down vote. There's no amendments permitted. So it is sort of a package deal at that point. Okay, so now the ball is back in the governor's court here. The General Assembly will go home. The budget goes through the enrolling process, which gets it in a form in which it can be considered reviewed by the governor. So the governor's office will be reviewing all the bills that come to the governor's office. And there's a 30-day turnaround time to act. Generally, by that point in the session, if bills are passed earlier in the session, it's a 7-day turnaround time. But by this point, when the General Assembly is adjourned, there's a 30-day deadline. So the governor has 3 options at this point for bills that come to him or her: sign them, veto, or offer amendments. So if the governor takes no action, the bills become law without his or her signature. So in other words, you can't pocket veto a bill in Virginia. So sometimes VACo will ask for amendments. We've typically communicated that by letter. Sometimes we've involved members have been asked to reach out and assist with requests for amendments. And then once the governor's amendments are released, we will review all those amendments and we provide an overview in the newsletter. So you'll want to kind of keep an eye out for that. All right, so now the ball is back in the General Assembly's court. So the reconvene session where the where the General Assembly has an opportunity to consider all of the governor's amendments and vetoes is typically 6 weeks after adjournment of the session. And so usually there's about a week and a half between the governor releasing amendments and the reconvene session taking place. So in that intervening time, of course, we're reviewing those amendments and deciding whether we like them or not. And so there's an opportunity to advocate there in support of or opposition to gubernatorial amendments or vetoes for that matter. And so the legislature has the opportunity to review all of these amendments and vetoes. They can accept or reject amendments to bills, including the budget in whole or in part, and then consider vetoes. And so there's also an opportunity to override. This is a very tall order because you have to have a supermajority in both chambers. So that's rarely been successful, overriding a governor's veto. So then at this point, the governor, the General Assembly's actions are communicated back to the governor, who now has another 30 days to take final action on legislation that comes back, including the budget. And so the governor has line item veto authority because at this point the action is either to sign or to veto something that comes back at this point in the legislative process. So the governor has line item veto authority for the Appropriation Act, but there's been kind of an interesting judicial history about what types of things in the budget are subject to being vetoed. In other words, what counts as an item? How linked is an item in the rest of the budget that it could be sort of lifted out with the governor's veto or not. So there's been a lot of sort of litigation in Supreme Court cases in the past over how broadly that power can be exercised. So the governor will take these final actions. And so just for context and sort of the calendar, in a long session, that reconvene session, as mentioned, is usually mid to late April. And then the governor's final deadline, now we're sort of into mid to late May. So we're well into the calendar year by the time this process is wrapping up. And so in terms of advocating, we sometimes will be asking at this point in the May opportunity for in support of or opposition to a signing or vetoing of legislation. And so just to kind of bring it back to the local government lens here, at the same time as the General Assembly is working through the budget process, local governments are working on a parallel track in the spring to be preparing their own budgets for adoption. And so there's a series of deadlines that have to be met at the local level. And so sometimes there's some challenges with the state budget moving on this parallel process if the state budget is delayed. And so that has happened sometimes in recent years. Some of the deadlines that the locality has to meet is approving the school transfer, advertising your proposed budget, holding a hearing, and adopting your budget and tax rates by July 1st. So we recognize, and the General Assembly recognizes, it's difficult to adopt your local budget when you're waiting to know what you're going to be receiving from your main funding partner. So there are some requirements in the code that are intended to make sure that localities have at least some of the data points that you need to plan your own budget. So there's requirements to provide a local option sales and use tax estimates, and estimates from the compensation board about state support for your constitutional offices, and then an estimate of your receipt of K-12 basic aid. So that's intended to help. We certainly recognize that these processes don't always sync up perfectly. And so certainly at VACo, we share any information that we get, along the way. And then we will kind of wrap up here with a slide, just with a few sort of parting thoughts. I would say certainly we would say that the budget is a very powerful document in that it appropriates all state resources. There's a considerable amount of policy in that document. In terms of process, it is essentially year round. As you can see, we were sort of wrapping up in May with the governor's final actions potentially, and that's not a long time before the state agencies are starting to prepare their package of requests, working with the Department of Planning and Budget for the next year. So it is really a year-round process. So there's also opportunities in that year-round process to make your voice heard, so to advocate early and often, to make sure to make your case for your locality's needs. Hopefully this webinar has kind of been helpful in providing some of those opportunities. Please don't hesitate to reach out to VACo with any questions that you have anytime during the year. We try to be on top of the budget process, and we're very happy to assist with any questions or research projects that you might have. So Jim, any parting thoughts from you as we wrap up?
Well, I think you said, Kate, but I'm going to reiterate the Appropriation Act supersedes everything except the state constitution. That's why it's so important. So even though it's only a 2-year document, you'll often see policy issues that just get extended every 2 years. And so they're in the Appropriation Act, and statutory does not override the budget. It's vice versa. The budget overrides anything in the statute. So you'll see things sometimes in the statute that says one thing, and you go, well, why isn't this happening? Well, the budget's overwritten, and they've made that choice and that's what gives the money committees in the General Assembly so much power, because they sort of have the final say on most everything except the Constitution.
That's a great point. Well, thank you, Jim, for being part of this webinar. We really appreciate your partnership as always. We're going to be posting this online, hoping that it's a helpful resource as we at VACo start working through this coming budget that we'll be seeing here in a few weeks, and also future budgets. So Jim, thanks again.
Thank you.